Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome for our new video on public history. And this week we have a special guest for a discussion on public history and applied history, differences, similarities, definitions. So thank you to join us today. Bram, can you say a bit something about you?
Yeah, sure I can. First and foremost, thanks for having me in your series. It's a real pleasure to be here and to talk about applied history and public history. I'm Bram de Ridder. I work as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Leuven in their early modern history department. I've worked previously on international relations. I've worked on border history for my PhD in history at the University of Leuven. And then I spent some time about 6-7 months in Harvard as a visiting scholar, right at the moment when the Applied History Manifesto was launched there. So I was really at the right place and time at that moment. I used that time and space to write a project on applied history called Corvus, which we now have at the University of Leuven and the Belgian State Archives. And I am working in this project, mainly coordinating things, helping our two PhD students get along and find their way in applied history. So that's what I'm mainly doing at the moment.
And a lot has been going on about applied history in Holland, in other countries, and that's also the reason why I wanted to talk to you to explain the connection between applied history and public history. So could you introduce us to applied history? What's been going on about applied history lately?
Yeah, I think that last word is quite important, the lately, because applied history is not a new term. It's not a new concept. A lot of people have a lot of definitions or preconceptions about it. But when you say lately, then we're mainly talking, let's say, 2016, 2017, when a lot of applied history projects popped up, or at least a lot of projects and initiatives started using or reusing that particular term. Of course, there was the Applied History Manifesto by Graham Allison and Neil Ferguson. But then you had in 2020, there was a Dutch Applied History Manifesto related to COVID. There's Historians Without Borders in Finland. You have Corvus in Belgium, the UCLA Luskin. Villanova has the Lepage Center for History in the Public Interest. So there is a lot of things that has been going on. And important to realize, I think, is that a lot of that had to do with the circumstances in the world, or at least in our part of the world. You had in 2016, of course, Brexit. Then later in 2016, you had the Trump campaign, and eventually Trump, who became US president. And you could tell that a lot of historians, especially in the UK and the US, of course, but also broader, wanted to do something with that. They wanted to go into society. They wanted to use their historical expertise to get involved with these current events. And not all projects, not even our own, was directly related to those circumstances, but they at least benefited from it. There was a lot of more attention to applied history when you use the term. There was a lot more room for discussing these things or discussing history from a contemporary vantage point. So a lot of that was an important circumstance. There were other circumstances that played into it. As earlier with public history, there is sort of, I wouldn't call it the job crisis, but there is a certain change in where history PhDs will be employed in the future and are being employed. That plays into it. And a lot of funding agencies, for example, in Belgium, but also in the Netherlands, want to connect history and historical research with contemporary challenges. So that are kind of the three things that played into the latest resurgence of applied history. I think that's the main thing. A second element I want to briefly add is that a lot of the current projects start from a history and policy vantage point. Not all of them, but the most prominent ones, the Dutch one, the US one, the two manifestos. They didn't really mention public history and didn't seem to connect with that at first sight. And so there was a lot of reaction to, for example, the call for a White House Council for historians to get involved with Corona policy. Corona and COVID, of course, were a second element that helped historians to connect with contemporary events. But a lot of it was history and policy related. Not all of it, but it's really a narrative that we have to engage with. From our vantage point in Corvus. We are, as mentioned, the project between the University of Leuven in Flanders and the Belgian State Archives. We focus mainly on methodologies and tools for applied history. The Netherlands also has a focus on that, not particularly giving concrete examples or concrete searching a connection to policymakers, but also learning from that and spreading what you know about how to do that, with what tools, what works, what doesn't work. These kind of discussions are also very present. But again, in all of this, it's quite a recent development, the things that I've mentioned, but there is a lot more going on, and it connects to a lot of older discussions, also in terms of methods and tools, but in a lot of senses it connects to older elements of applied and public history, which I think you know very well, of course.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I completely agree. Applied history is to some extent older than public history. The first times that applied history was used, and you know that very well, was Benjamin Chambaud in the early 20th century in the United States, using again history for public policy as well. But you have other examples. You had in the UK, you had this applied historical practices in the 1960s with Michael Drake, and the first conference of applied history in Europe was in Holland in 1982 in Rotterdam. So you have a long history of the term applied history. And I think even at the beginning of the public history movement in the United States in the 1970s, people were using applied history, public history in very similar ways. And you had the first programs of applied history in Pittsburgh in 1975, so very closely related to the development of public history. And I think at the beginning of the public history movement, those terms were very synonymous. So I guess my second question is, how do you see the similarities and differences between applied history and public history? Are they the same things? What do you see the possible differences or different approaches?
That's a very good question, because it's a key question, and it's one that if you say that you're working in the field of applied history, or you're an applied historian, whatever that term means currently, one of the first questions you immediately get asked is that not the same as public history? Or it's even made as a statement, oh, so you're doing public history. One of the funnier things was when I was working on a paper for applied history, my search engine from my university constantly changed my search results for applied history to applied and public history. So even my institution was kind of including public history whenever I was looking specifically for applied history. The main thing, however, is that it depends on your definition of applied history and your definition of public history. It really depends on that, and there are circulating a lot of possible definitions of it. Two interesting elements there, for example, are that the Journal of Applied History, which was also recently founded, it doesn't want to force a definition of applied history. It doesn't start from this is it. It allows people in the journal to explore its meaning. Another is the fact that a lot of history and policy initiatives, which are often, especially given the latest search, now called applied history projects, actually do not ever use the term. History and policy in the UK is one of those examples. They are generally considered one of the prime and older examples of applied history, but their webpage barely reference it. Only in a few papers is applied history mentioned. It's so far it didn't really seem to matter for them as a concept or a term. On the other hand, you have some people with a background in public history, applied European contemporary Applied European Contemporary History Network. That's the full term, and I got it correctly. Starts clearly from a public history vantage point, and they argue that applied history is part of that, but somewhere in it, and that it's more oriented towards, let's say, the scholarly reflection on how the past is used. That's one possible definition of applied history. In other senses, people say public history is more bringing history to the public, whereas applied history is letting the public work with history. That's one possible definition as well. But for me, a lot of these things quickly become quite academic. We work with 11 societal partners in Corvus. And if I have to use the academic definitions of applied and public history, I know that we would quickly lose them because it's too abstract to get in all of these finesses, also given the older definitions in the 70s, 80s, 90s that were developed of the concept. So for us in Corvus, I think the main way that we try to see ourselves is as problem or challenge or issue oriented. So we really start from a contemporary vantage point, as a lot of the projects that I mentioned. Someone in the present needs to identify something as an issue, a problem, a challenge, something that they want to see addressed. That can be about the future, that can be at their present situation, but that's really the starting point. And from there, we can see what can historical expertise, historical knowledge bring to them. Important for us as well. When I say historical expertise and historical knowledge, we don't say that we have a real intimate knowledge of the past, but we know a lot about the past. We weren't there in history, so there is no direct access to it. That's not a claim that we're gonna make, but there are things that you can tell about the past that you know more or less certain, or that give you another perspective on things, or that put things in a longer perspective. That can be very valuable to our partners. Also, how are they using history? What historical narratives do they create when they're dealing with these problems or challenges? That are kind of the things that we are doing at the moment. And so for us, although other people might disagree and might have other definitions as mentioned, for us, a lot of public history is indeed about communicating things about the past into the present. You start from past perspective and you bring that forward, and that can be very interesting and very enlightening. We work the other way around. We start with a present vantage point, and from there we're going to see what history has to offer to us. So we're not really dealing with exhibitions, with documentaries, with public history books for a broader audience, unless they can help us deal with something in the present. If that's useful to our partners, then we will do it. But it's not our main element that we are bringing to that. So that's kind of our element of the differences and similarities. That being said, our definition, our working definition that we've put online, clearly states that we see ourselves as part of the public history movement, if you want to use that term, movement. But that given our connection to a non-academic public, of course, our interpretation of applied history is part of that. Also, I think there are a couple of elements that we do share, that we clearly share with public history in the broader sense. That's very clearly attention to what history can and cannot tell us, what we know and know that we can tell about the past, or how you can deal with the past in present circumstances. Not everything is possible. It's not a grab bag, so to speak, where you can pull anything out, any analogy, any comparison, any trends that might continue. That definitely is not how we approach it. With a lot of respect for archive sources and archive material, which is where our partners in the Belgian State Archives are of key importance. A lot of respect for historiography. Interpretations of the past differ, even among historians, so you have to respect that. There is not one interpretation of the past. There might be a dominant one, but you have to allow for historiographical debate within what you tell to your partners. There are the ethical questions that we deal with. I think those are kind of the elements that we definitely share with what all public historians try to do or do in their work. I don't know how you see that from your vantage point at the moment.
Yeah, I think we're on the same line. I think applied history is, as you said, very much about the present and problem solving. I think that's one of the key issues of applied history, solving problems in the present using historical methodology. So I think this is pretty clear. And defining public history applied is in itself very, very challenging. But I think this is one aspect of applied history. My understanding is that applied history could be part of a broader definition of public history. And that's at least how I see it. And I think the key aspect is to discuss the role of historians and the use of history. And I think applied history, public history are answers to those questions of why do we need historians? Why do we need history? And I think talking to non-academic partners, this is the question. This is what can historians and history bring to the present, to understanding of the past. I think, as you mentioned, exhibitions and communication is not really part of applied history. And I think this may be one difference in the sense that many historians and partners now accept public history because they see the benefit of communicating history to a large audience. And this is, to some extent, what historians do. So they kind of accept and like that. If you talk to historians about using their methodology, history, for the present, I think there is an alarm bell in their head saying, well, be careful, use of the past, propaganda, and so on. So I think to some extent applied history may be scarier for some colleagues who do not want to use or solve problems in the present. So this may be one, I wouldn't say differences, but a different approach of the past. But if we go back to the definition by Robert Kelly of public history, it's the use of historians, but also the methodology outside the classroom. So to some extent, using history and methodology for public policy, for environmental policy. So I think this application of historical methodology to the present was already at the origins of the public history movement. So this is why I include applied history in the application as one specific use, but as part of public history. And you have, in the United States, we have many, members of the public history movements that work for the federal government or for public policy institutions, and they consider themselves public historians, and they also do applied history. So it is very difficult to distinguish between public history and applied history, but I think we have lots in common. In common. Do you see? How do you see? And that's maybe the last question. How do you see the future of applied history? I think it's booming in Holland and in the UK. You have applied history. Alex Green is doing a lot of applied history. What do you foresee for the next step? Do you see the journal? Do you see conferences? Do you see relation with public history?
It's one of the let me say the cheap answer to this is the same answer I give to all of our partners when it comes to the future. That is that I really stress to them that we cannot predict the future. So I will not predict the future of applied history in any sense. For us, yes, workshop conferences. We're also starting to organize those in the next, let's say, 2 years. That in Leuven. And with the State Archives that we will be doing some of these initiatives. There is indeed a very good relationship between people working on applied history in the Netherlands and in Belgium. So that's we're in a good spot here in Leuven. That really helps. So it's really bringing a lot of people together that will matter in the next 2-3 years, and see where that brings us. Because one issue that you have at the moment is that applied history also suffers a bit from inflation of the term. All of a sudden, a lot of things become applied history, and you see terms like new applied history emerge, or history in the public interest, history with a public purpose that then is related or redefined as applied history, whether or not that term was used in the original meaning of those words. So you have to we'll have to see what goes on there, but that is a normal process when something like this starts to grow. For us, I think the main element indeed will be, will it develop into something that is recognizable, that still fits within public history, but that a lot more people can say, I'm an applied historian and I do this and I work with that, and that there is some, not common ground, but common understanding of what methods are available. Also, given that we're in a digital age at the moment, a lot of applied history methods go back to, for example, Ernst May in the 80s. Let's see if we can renew a lot of elements there and start building on that. I think for me that are the main things I hope we will see happening with applied history in the future.
Well, I would like to thank you very much, Bram, for your input and for this discussion. We're going to put a lot of resources in the description under the video. So if people have questions or they want to know more about the manifesto, about you, about the Journal of Applied History or discussions, they can find more resources under the discussion. And as usual, if you have comments or questions about applied history, about public history, feel free to comment under the video. So once again, thank you very much, Bram, for this discussion, very important discussion. And we encourage you to see the other videos about public history, definitions, communication, and other issues. Thank you very much, Bram.
Thank you. And indeed, do watch those videos. I watched them myself. So please follow this channel in any capacity you can.
Thank you, Bram. Have a very nice day.
Bye-bye.